Arizona Territory, March 1879. The wind howled low through the cottonwoods that lined the edge of Dry Creek Cemetery, tugging the black veil from Joanna Adler's bonnet as the last shovelful of dirt landed on her husband's grave. He had been 33. A fever took him in 2 days. No warning, no time to say goodbye. Now he was beneath the earth, and she stood there alone, hands stiff and cold around the folded lace handkerchief she had not used. There was no family left. No children, no relatives coming on the train. Just her and the simple pine box that had been lowered into the red-brown dirt by 2 strangers from town. When the preacher closed his worn Bible and tipped his hat, the townsfolk began to drift away. A few nodded to her, but no one lingered. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. Someone coughed, boots shuffled. Then silence. "You should not be here alone, ma'am." Joanna turned. A tall man stood just behind her, hat in hand, the wind stirring the dust around his boots. He looked like he had come a long way, trail-worn coat, sun-cut lines across his face, the kind of man who had seen more than he ever spoke about. "I'm not expecting anyone," she said, voice even, though it felt like it belonged to someone else. He nodded once. "Name's Silas Zimmerman. I rode in this morning from 3 Forks, heard about the fever taking a few folks here, was asking about work when I saw the crowd out here." She blinked. "You came to a funeral of someone you didn't know." He looked down at the fresh mound of dirt. "I know what it feels like to lower someone and have no one left to watch with you." Joanna's throat tightened. She looked away, but not before he saw it. "I am sorry," he added softly. There was something about the way he said it, like he meant every word, like it came from a place carved out by his own losses. She straightened. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman." "Silas," he corrected gently. Joanna nodded once. "Joanna Adler." The wind picked up again, sharp and dry. Silas looked toward the town. "You have a place to go, I have the house. For now." He stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the wind. "That's something." She did not know why, but she did not want to walk back alone. She hesitated, then asked, "Are you staying in town?" "Was planning to. Supposed to meet the livery owner about work." She looked up at him, searching his face. He did not look like he was trying to impress anyone. His eyes were steady, a shade of gray she had never seen before. "My husband was the blacksmith," she said after a moment. "The shop's closed now." "I know horses," he said. "Tools, too." He did not offer more. He did not need to. They walked back together. She did not speak, and he did not fill the silence. It was not until they reached the edge of town that she stopped. "I should go in alone," she said. He nodded. "If you need anything." She looked at him, something shifting behind her tired eyes. "I do not have anyone left," she whispered. Silas did not flinch. He reached out, resting a hand on her arm, not hard, just steady. "You've got me now." The words were simple, but they stuck. She looked into his face, searching for doubt. There was none. Joanna walked the rest of the way to the house alone, but she did not feel as alone as she had that morning. That night, the house felt too quiet. She lit a lamp and set it near the kitchen table. The tools on the workbench were untouched. Her husband's coat still hung near the door. She stared at it for a long time, then slipped it from the hook and folded it away. The knock came just as she sat at the table with a half-empty cup of tea. She opened the door and found Silas standing there, holding a wrapped cloth bundle. "I figured you might not have had supper. Brought something from the saloon kitchen." She hesitated, then stepped aside. He set the bundle down and unwrapped it without a word. It was simple bread, smoked meat, and 2 apples, but it felt like more than food. They ate in silence. At one point, their hands brushed, reaching for the same slice of bread. She looked up, startled, but he only smiled faintly and pulled his hand back. Afterward, he stood. "I will let you rest." "Thank you," she said. He turned at the door. "I meant what I said." She watched him disappear into the dark, the sound of his boots fading into the night. Over the next few days, Silas came by the house often. He fixed the loose shutter, repaired the fence out back. When the blacksmith shop sat quiet and unused, he cleaned it up and relit the forge. Joanna watched him work from the porch. He was different from her husband, quieter, more careful with his words, but there was something solid in the way he moved, like he had spent years carrying other people's weight and never dropped a thing. One afternoon, she brought him a glass of water. "You do not have to do all this." He looked up at her, light catching the sweat on his brow. I know, she hesitated. Why are you? He wiped his hands and met her eyes. Because I want to. That night, she found herself setting 2 plates on the table. He stayed for supper and they talked. Not about her husband, not about the past, just about simple things: the weather, the land, the way the forge sounded when it was hot. She laughed once and it startled her. He looked at her when she did, a quiet warmth in his eyes. By the end of the week, the forge was back in working order and Silas had taken over the shop. Folks in town started bringing him work, and they talked about how he never said much, but his hands were steady and his work was clean. Joanna still wore black. She still woke before dawn and sat by the fire alone for a while. But when Silas came in each morning, she met him with coffee and a quiet nod. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she stood at the back of the property, looking out over the empty stretch of land. Silas came up beside her. You all right? She nodded. It is strange, I thought I would feel empty. And you do not, I feel, like I am waiting. He looked at her. For what? She turned, her eyes met his. There was no fear in them now, just something open, something new. I do not know. He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His hand stayed there, cupping her jaw, rough fingers warm against her skin. I will wait with you, he said. She leaned into his touch just slightly. And for the first time since that morning at the graveyard, she felt something stir in her chest that was not grief. It felt like the start of something real. Joanna dipped the brush into the basin and ran it slow across the edge of the porch rail, the pale green paint drying under the morning heat. Her wrist ached in the same quiet way her ribs did when she took a breath too deep an ache that reminded her she was still here, still moving. From the yard, Sila's voice carried up. You always work before breakfast, she glanced down. He stood near the hitching post, coat slung over one shoulder, a small wrapped cloth in hand. I don't sleep past sunrise, she said, setting the brush aside. And the rail's been splintering since winter. He stepped up onto the porch, offering her the cloth. Cornbread, still warm. She took it, surprised by the smell of honey. Where'd you get this? Mrs. Fillmore at the boarding house. Traded 2 boot repairs for a batch. Joanna let out a breath, almost a laugh but not quite. You bartering with baked goods now. I figured you might eat more if someone else put it in your hands. His gaze met hers steady. That's not a complaint, just truth. She sat on the porch step and broke the bread in half, offering him a piece. You always speak like that. Like what? Like you've already thought it through 10 times before saying it once. He took the bread. Words weigh more when you've carried too many. She studied him a moment. His shoulders were broad but sloped with use, not pride. A man who'd been leaned on more than he'd leaned. She didn't ask about where he'd come from or who he'd lost. Not yet. Instead, she said, I have a parcel of land behind the barn. My husband meant to plant there this spring. What sort of crop? Beans, mostly. Maybe squash. It's rocky, needs clearing. I'll look at it after the forge cools. Joanna nodded once. If you're not too tired. I'm never too tired for useful work. She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. You don't have to prove anything here. I know. He tipped his hat and turned toward the shop. Joanna watched him go, the way he didn't hurry, didn't drag his feet either. Just a man walking with purpose, like he belonged to the earth more than the town. By noon, she found him behind the barn with a spade in hand, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. The rocky soil gave under his boots as he worked, steady and silent. She brought water, passed it to him without a word, and stood beside the fence watching the sun trace shadows over the hill. My father called this kind of soil unforgiving, she said after a long while. Silas paused, wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. It's stubborn. Not impossible. She leaned on the fence rail. I used to think the land here was too harsh to keep anything growing. You stayed. I did. He looked at her, something softer in his face now. You always this stubborn too. I prefer the word resilient. He smiled at that, small but real. That's harder to come by than most think. Later, when the wind picked up and the clouds thickened in the west, Joanna pulled the clothesline down and brought the wash inside. The sky held that heavy quiet that came before a storm out here, where there was no tree line to muffle it. It made the house feel smaller but not empty. Silas came through the door just before the first drops hit the roof. He carried a wooden crate under one arm, the other hand wrapped in a cloth. What happened? He held it up. Caught a nail wrong. Nothing deep. She took the cloth and led him to the basin. You don't flinch. Doesn't help anything. She cleaned the wound, the silence between them filling with the sound of rain on the tin roof. His hand was rough, fingers nicked and calloused, but he held still while she bound it. You were careful not to bleed on the floor, she said. I didn't want to track it in. Joanna tied the bandage and stepped back. You're a strange kind of man, Silas. Don't know how else to be. The storm came in hard after dusk. Thunder rolled low and slow, and the oil lamp flickered against the glass. She made a stew from the last of the smoked meat, and they ate at the table without speaking much, the kind of quiet that didn't press down but settled in. He finished his bowl and set the spoon aside. You planning to stay here? Long term? She looked up. Where else would I go? Some folks run when they lose too much. I'm not running, he nodded. Good, this land could use a woman who knows how to hold her ground. She felt her cheeks warm, though she didn't look away. You think you'll stay too? He leaned back, arms crossed. If there's a place for me. Joanna stood, gathered the dishes. There's work and company. That enough for you? She turned, met his eyes. Might be. He watched her for a long moment. The thunder faded to a distant grumble, and the fire in the stove crackled soft. I won't step where I'm not wanted. You're not unwelcome. That was all she said. But he stood, took his coat, and said good night with a quiet nod. The door closed behind him, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands still wet, unsure why the space he'd left behind didn't feel so hollow anymore. Out on the porch, Silas leaned against the rail and watched the sky for a long while before heading toward the bunkhouse behind the shop. He didn't need to see her face to know she'd be watching too. From the upstairs window, light flickering behind the curtain. Neither of them said it, but something had begun to settle between them like soil turned over and ready, waiting for something to grow. By late April, the soil behind the barn had turned forgiving. Rows of beans pushed up in neat lines, their green shoots steady against the wind. Joanna knelt between them, easing a stone from the earth with her gloved hands. The sun pressed against her shoulders, warm but not harsh, and the air held the faint scent of iron from the forge drifting in from the shop. She stood when she heard Boots approach, brushing the dust from her skirt. I didn't expect you back till evening, she said. Silas shrugged off his coat and hooked it on the fence. Wheel on McRae's wagon cracked clean through, nothing to do till he brings the rest of it in. She noticed the faint soot along his collar, the way his knuckles were scraped raw. You overworked again. I won't break, he said. You need help here, she nodded toward the rows. I was going to set stakes for the runners. He stepped into the patch, squatting beside her, fingers already reaching for the twine in her apron pocket. You always this quiet when you work? She asked. He started tying the first stake. Helps me think. About what? He glanced up. Whether I've stayed too long in one place. Joanna's hands paused. Do you want to leave? No. He tied another knot. But wanting and being allowed are different things. She didn't answer right away, just drove her own stake into the soil and began tying the vine along its length. You're not unwelcome, she said. That's not the same as being wanted. She looked over, met his eyes. I wouldn't ask you to stay just to fill a space. I know, he stood, brushing dirt from his palms, but if I did stay, I'd want to know I wasn't just passing time. Joanna straightened slowly. You'd be building something. They didn't say more, but they worked side by side until the sun lowered past the ridge and the dirt cooled under bare hands. That evening, she lit a second lamp without thinking. He arrived just as she stepped out onto the porch with a tin basin of water to rinse her arms. I went by the feed store, he said. They're expecting a shipment of lumber next week out of Prescott. She poured water over her hands. We could use some new boards for the chicken coop. I was thinking more about the lean-to behind the shop. If I built it out, it'd make room for a second anvil. She dried her hands on her apron. You planning to stay long enough to need one? He stepped up onto the porch, close enough that she could see the dust clinging to his lashes. Depends, he said. On what? On whether this house still feels like yours. Joanna didn't answer, not yet. Instead, she stepped back into the kitchen and reached for the tin of coffee. I've got enough water boiled. He followed her inside. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting a soft orange across the walls. She poured 2 cups and sat, folding her hands around the warmth. Silas leaned against the doorframe, cup resting in one palm. "I fought with my brother before I left Kansas," he said suddenly. She looked up. "He took over the farm after our father died. Thought I should stay and marry the neighbor girl, said I owed it to the family." "I didn't want that life." Joanna listened, quiet. "I haven't written since I left. Sometimes I think about it, but then I remember how he looked at me that last day like I'd stolen something that wasn't mine." She set her cup down. "You ever think about going back?" He shook his head. "The land's too small. I need more sky than that." She understood that, not with words, but in her bones. "I came here because my husband wanted to carve something from the edge of a map," she said. "I stayed because I didn't know how to do anything else." He moved toward the table, pulled the second chair out and sat. "If you had the choice now?" he asked. She looked at him. The lamplight caught the curve of his jaw, the line of a scar near his temple she hadn't noticed before. "I'd still be here," she said. Silas nodded but didn't speak. He just reached across the table and let his hand rest near hers, not touching, just there. Present, she didn't pull away. Outside, the wind shifted. A soft creak came from the porch rail and the chickens rustled in their coop. The quiet settled again, but it didn't feel empty. After a while, she rose and gathered the cups. "You'll need to get up early if you're hauling beams from the yard tomorrow," she said. He stood too, reaching for his coat. "I'll be here before light." She paused, then placed her hand gently over his forearm just once. "I know." He didn't speak, just held her gaze a moment longer, then stepped out into the dark. Joanna stood in the doorway, the warmth of the room behind her, the cool breath of night on her face. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was waiting anymore. She felt like something had already begun. The sun rose behind a veil of low cloud, softening the shape of the hills beyond the forge. A breeze carried the scent of mesquite and the far-off tang of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Joanna stepped out into the morning with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and the sleeves of her dress rolled to the elbow. She crossed the yard toward the barn where Silas had already unlatched the gate and set the wagon near the back wall. He glanced up from where he was fitting his hands around the end of a long beam. "You ready to haul?" "I've got the harness laid out. Mule's still chewing, but she'll move when I ask." He waited while she looped the bridle and checked the yoke, letting her work without stepping in. When the mule was hitched and the wagon creaked beneath the first cut of lumber, he climbed up beside her without a word. They rode in silence toward the edge of town, where the lumber sat stacked under canvas from the last freight wagon out of Prescott. The mule's hooves kicked up dust that clung to the hem of Joanna's skirt and the folds of Silas's trousers. "Jacob always meant to build a shelter for the forge," she said after a while, voice low, "but he never got around to it." Silas adjusted the brim of his hat against the light. "You want it built the way he planned it," she shook her head. "I want it built the way it ought to be." He nodded once, and they said no more. At the yard, they loaded the lumber in measured silence. Silas secured each beam with twine while Joanna checked the iron nails and hinges she'd brought from the storeroom. When they turned the wagon back toward the house, the wind had shifted, and the clouds above had thickened to a dull gray. "Storm'll come by nightfall," he said. "Long as it holds till we finish the frame." They unloaded quickly, stacking the lumber beside the forge where the ground had been leveled the day before. Silas drew a line in the dirt with the toe of his boot, marking the edge of the posts. "I'll dig the footing," he said. "You feel up to sawing boards. I've done worse with less." They worked until the light began to thin. Joanna didn't complain when her palms blistered, and Silas didn't pause except to check the level of each post. "I used to build fences with my uncle," she said, measuring a board with her thumb. He never trusted a man who cut corners. Silas drove a nail with a firm strike. He was right not to. By the time the frame stood upright, the wind had turned sharp. Joanna wiped the back of her wrist across her brow, leaving a streak of dust beneath her hairline. Silas handed her a dipper of water from the barrel near the porch. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding to her hand. She looked down. A shallow line had opened across her palm where a nail had caught her. "It'll close." He didn't argue. Instead, he took the hand gently and wrapped it in a strip of cloth torn from the inside lining of his coat. She watched his face as he worked his brow drawn, jaw tight with care. When he finished, he didn't let go right away. "You should let yourself rest," he said. She looked at him, the space between them narrowing in the quiet. "I don't know how to rest," she said. "Then let me teach you." Joanna's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way the words fit between them like something long owed. "I'm not looking for rescue," she said. "I'm not offering that," he said. "I'm offering to stand beside you." She stepped closer, their hands still joined between them. "I thought I'd buried everything that mattered," she said, voice trembling for the first time since that morning at the graveyard. "You didn't," he said. "You just hadn't found the rest yet." The wind swept through the yard, lifting dust and carrying the scent of rain. Joanna leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against his chest. He didn't move, didn't tighten his hold or speak again. He simply stood with her, steady as earth, while the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain passed quickly that night, soft and steady, leaving the earth dark and sweet-smelling by morning. When Joanna stepped outside, the porch boards damp beneath her boots, she saw the lean-to had held through the weather. Silas had risen before her, his tools laid out in a clean row beside the forge, smoke curling faint from the chimney. She crossed the yard, her shawl drawn close against the morning chill. "You didn't wait for me to start," she said. He didn't look up from the plank he was shaping. "Didn't figure you'd mind." "I don't," she said. "But I was going to ask if you'd come into town with me." He paused, lifting his head. "What for?" "There's a land agent arriving on the freight coach. He's got the new township plats. I want to make the homestead official." Silas set the plane aside. "I thought it was already yours." "It was Jacob's by squatter's rights, but there's a chance to file under my name now. The town's starting to recognize widows as legal holders. I'd rather not leave it in question." He nodded once. "I'll go with you." They rode in the wagon, the mule pulling steady through the muddy road. The town looked different in the light of spring doors open, canvas awnings lifted, folks working with sleeves rolled, not just surviving but building again. Joanna felt the change in the air, the way people looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with quiet respect. The land agent, a thin man with a ledger and spectacles that slipped down his nose, asked her to spell her name twice. She signed with a steady hand, then turned toward Silas. "Could you witness?" He took the pen without hesitation, his signature clean and plain beside hers. On the ride back, her fingers brushed his on the reins. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the house, the back rooms never used." He didn't answer right away. "You want to rent it?" She shook her head. "No, I want to offer it to you." He shifted slightly on the bench, the reins slack in his hands. "I don't want to be just a guest under your roof." "You wouldn't be," she said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it wasn't the kind that needed filling. That evening, she folded the bedding in the back room herself. It had once been meant for a child. She'd never spoken of it, not even to Jacob. But now, as she laid the quilt flat and set the basin by the window, she didn't feel the hollowness that used to gather in her chest. Silas came in just after dusk, arms streaked with ash, shirt damp at the collar. "You sure?" he asked, standing in the doorway. She looked at him, then past him, toward the hearth where the fire crackled low. "I'm sure." He set down his bag, small, worn, with the leather soft from years of use. She watched him look around the room, then back at her. "I won't overstep," he said. "You already stepped in," she replied, voice quiet, "and I haven't asked you to leave." He moved toward her, slow and careful. His hands found hers, calloused and warm. "I've been waiting to know what to call this," he said. "You don't have to name it," she said. "You just have to stay." "I will," he said. She leaned into him then, her cheek against the place where his collarbone met his shoulder. He didn't speak again, just wrapped his arms around her and held her there while the room settled into stillness. The days that followed turned soft with rhythm. Silas rose early to tend the forge, but came in for supper without being called. Joanna worked the garden in the mornings and sewed in the afternoons by the window, where the light fell warm on the floorboards. One evening, after the last horse was shoed and the last seedbed turned, they sat on the porch with the sun dropping low across the hills. Silas had built a bench from leftover planks, and they sat side by side, her head resting against his shoulder. "It's strange," she said. "To feel safe again." It's not strange, he said. It's earned. She turned her face toward him. You want to stay this way? I do, she smiled, small and full. Then we'll make it last. He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't reach for promises but placed them, one by one, like stones in a foundation. They were married in June, in the clearing behind the barn, with cottonwood petals drifting through the air and the preacher from the next town over reading from a worn leather Bible. No grand dress, no feast, just neighbors standing quiet, the forge cold for a day, and Joanna's hand in Silas's as they spoke their vows. He built a second room onto the house, not because they needed it, but because he wanted to leave space for what might come. She embroidered new curtains and hung them herself. By autumn, the garden had yielded beans enough to store and squash enough to trade. The townsfolk came to Silas for their tools and wagon repairs, and some started calling the place Zimmerman's, though Joanna's name remained on the deed. They didn't speak often of what came before, neither the Kansas farm nor the fever that had taken Jacob, but they didn't have to. The past had shaped them, but it no longer held them. On quiet nights, with the fire low and their hands joined across the table, Joanna would sometimes say, "We've come farther than I thought we could." And Silas, without fail, would answer, "We're still going." They grew old that way, together, and it was enough, more than enough.